look at the, no, that's fine.
I forgot to start the recording.
That's totally fine. And look at the whatever kind of parameters you've been given for a proposal before you start writing it, because they often have these really weird and specific requests that you do things. Oh, we can't see the screen. No, it's fine. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties as always. Okay.
My fault.
No worries at all. Yeah, so we're going to talk about some of the ways they're similar, writing strategies you can use for all of them, and also some of the ways that they are different. And again, referring you back to the fact that if you want to talk about writing to really specific grant and fellowship briefs, sometimes talking with Michael Decker is a good thing to do. But so I'm actually going to start off because I really want to make this as useful as possible for all of you, with a quick reflection, just giving everyone a minute, because I would love to get some questions from you guys before I start so that I can, again, address those as I go along. Hopefully some of them I'm already going to talk about, but I just always like to start out with a little bit of understanding of where everyone in the room is at and what kinds of questions you have. So I'm just going to give you like a minute or two just to think about these questions. And then if you feel like asking one, to ask one. I'm not going to say like everyone has to ask a question, but if you want to either say something that, so I think to start off, just how you are thinking about research proposals, you can think about what you already know about them, because sometimes people are like, come in and they're basically like, I know nothing about them. And sometimes they're like, I know they should be this, but I'm struggling with doing it, struggling to do it. And sometimes people have like a very specific question or something their advisor told them and they don't know how to address. So yeah, I'm hoping let's just take a couple minutes to reflect and think about these three questions if you feel like it, and then hopefully can get some questions from people in the room. And if you feel up to it on Zoom, put some questions in the chat, or else unmute yourself and you can just ask it. So we'll start that now and just take a couple minutes. Yeah, these are good questions. Okay, cool. Structure, questions, content, yeah. Whether it's different from general scientific writing.
Are you going to read those questions out loud?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I'm not interrupting your thinking. But yeah, I'll go ahead and read the questions we already have in the chat. If anyone else wants to throw any in, and if anyone here wants to ask a question out loud, just let me know. But we do have a question here. I don't really know if there's any difference between general research writing, i.e. scientific paper, and research proposals kind of writing. And then another person was asking, yeah, we have a few questions basically about from people who've been given different examples of dissertation proposals, but with slightly different structures and lengths. So people wanting to know about the structure, page limit, and contents of a dissertation proposal. Okay. that's what we've got so far. Does anyone in the room have a question you want to ask? Yeah.
So, I mean, in general, I know what a research proposal is about. Like, you're proposing to your committee that
Yeah.
you're going to work on a certain research project. But my question is, do you also need to explain like your like research design and how you're going to conduct your experiments and everything? Because like in my field in human factors, we usually do experiments with people, so we also have to go through IRB to get the approvals and everything. So I think there's just a lot of things to consider before doing that. So I just want to know if those things should also be included in the proposal.
Yeah, so we had a question in here about like how much about the research design, right, and ethical factors, IRB plan, all of that stuff. Yeah, that's a good question. The really short answer for most of these is that your department may or may not have specific guidelines for it, but if they don't, generally, yes, you do include stuff about that in a really detailed plan for your research, and including ethical concerns and plans for IRB approval and all of that. So yeah, we'll talk a bit about the structure and content question. Again, we're gonna like talk about it generally throughout this slideshow, because of course I know there's people here from all different disciplines, but I do know the specific parameters for some of the departments and not for others, which was not through lack of trying. But for the ones that I know, I'm happy to answer more specific questions if people ask them. Otherwise, I always just tell you, like, ask your advisors, ask someone at your department and see if you can get more information, because they do vary quite a bit. But we'll talk about basically what should be in them, the general structure and length guidelines that I've seen at the university. Oh yeah, and also this question of, I guess to go quickly to Irma's question about the difference between general research writing and a scientific paper, I do think that proposals often it depends on what they are for, but they're often a little bit more accessible than a scientific paper, because sometimes you are writing them for an audience that knows not very much about your field. And so you want to do a mixture of show through the detail that you know exactly what you're doing, but also make your writing like extra clear, accessible, and maybe a little bit simplified for whether it's fellowship or grant reviewers who don't know anything about your specific field of study, or committee members who are in different departments and stuff like that. So sometimes they are a little bit simpler. Thesis and dissertation proposals, I think, are less different from just a thesis or dissertation. And often, in fact, and this is something we're going to talk about, people will just use their proposal as the first half of their thesis or dissertation, which is why it's really good to write a strong proposal. Saves you a ton of time at the end of your program. But yeah, for grant proposals, typically the style sometimes is more accessible and more like really well-researched journalistic style or something than like very jargony. Others are very scientific, and it's less true that they have to be different. So I think that's the kind of thing where you really want to think about your exact audience and who you're applying for the grant from. So we'll talk more about that too. There is another question in here, which is, I've been told that a research proposal should contain all the background information, literature summary questions, your plan, your adjusting and plan methods, basically everything that pertains to your research and will end up being part of your dissertation. Yes, that is all true. Then you just have to add in what you actually did and what the results mean. Yes, so you know a lot about it. Hopefully some parts of this presentation will be repetitive to you, but we'll talk a little bit about writing strategies for doing that as well. So okay, if anyone has more questions as we go along, just pop them in the chat or you guys can ask them. So we were going to talk, I was thinking it's especially helpful. It seemed like people like found it a bit helpful with the abstract presentation to really think about this being like a very audience facing piece of writing. And if you are someone, and that kind of gets back to Irma's question of like how technical it should be. But if you are someone who went to some kind of in composition 101 class in college, I'm sure you talked about the rhetorical situation. But thinking about the rhetorical situation of research proposals, I think is really helpful. And of course, this is true with all kinds of writing, but because you're literally kind of like asking your audience for something very specifically, thinking a lot about the specific needs of that audience is really helpful. So basically, you're thinking about the rhetorical situation of a piece of writing. The main things you want to think about are like what form it's going to take, the genre, which is of course the research proposal, but also who the audience is for that piece of writing and what its purpose is. And so I think for thinking about how to like craft a strong proposal, thinking about those two things, audience and purpose, quite a lot is really helpful. So the abstract's job is to persuade the audience to read or invest in your work by sharing those really brief, big picture highlights. And a proposal is like an abstract in that it's trying to persuade a specific audience that your work is important to your field. But it also needs to show that your work can be completed by you. Is there a way to get that out of the way so that we can see the whole thing? It's okay. But so that your work can be completed by you, which means that it generally needs to include a lot of carefully chosen detail as well. So again, a lot of this.
I'm gonna try stopping the video in the room.
Okay.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Now it's gone. They won't be able to see the room anymore though.
Oh,
But
well,
now it's not blocking.
either way.
That's okay.
Would you guys rather be seen on Zoom or be able to see the slides? Okay, so quickly thinking about the purpose of the proposal, again, all should be quite obvious, but sometimes it helps you play. I think like with proposals, having extreme clarity in your thoughts is what will lead to extreme clarity in your writing. So helping you clarify your research questions and form a plan for your research is a big like thing that the proposal does. And the committees see it this way. And a lot of people I know who I've talked to who come into the Writing Center and just defended their proposal, they were like, it was super helpful because I had been living, especially with a PhD for the last few years, just like having my research exist in my head, never having to like hone down and clarify it enough that it could be conveyed to an audience outside of my field or outside of my lab. And this was the first time that I had to sit down and do that. And it also helped me really clarify my questions, narrow the scope of my research, maybe make my like plan more effective in some way or other. So that's one job of the proposal. And I think your committee knows that. And that's part of what they want is for you to take this time to really think about your work and put it into writing, which can also clarify your thinking and so your whole plan. Obviously, the other job of the proposal is to convince your advisor and committee that your research will make a valuable contribution to your field. And I know that some of the departments say this, like their proposals do a good job of documenting the plan of research, but they are at root like also argumentative essays in a way where you're arguing that your research is making this larger contribution to your field and you're arguing that it's important. And so I know, for example, the education department's like description of their proposals, they're like, that's often a weakness in proposals that we see is that that bigger picture argument is missing from them. And so thinking about that is helpful. Obviously, on the other hand, you also have to convince them that you have a feasible plan for completing your research and a thorough understanding of your theoretical frameworks, methodologies, data analysis methods, all of that. So you do have to show that you've thought it all through very carefully. And I think a lot of people kind of only think it through very carefully as they put this piece of writing together. So that's another purpose of the document. And then, yeah, like we said before, for the departments. I think a few departments don't require that you do a full written proposal, and some of the students come into the writing center at the last minute before they're supposed to defend, being like, I have all this writing to do. Whereas committees and departments that require more writing earlier on, it really puts you on that like step-by-step track. So you can often then finish your dissertation with very few revisions to the first part of your piece of writing, your thesis or your dissertation. So also, yeah, but basically they're pretty high stakes pieces of writing. So for some people, this is they're doing this kind of thing all the time and they've already done a master's, now they're doing their PhD. For other people, they come in and they're like, this is the first thing I've written that isn't like a homework assignment, where I'm actually asking people to put a ton of money and time into my work. So in that sense, they are pretty high stakes. I was talking with Jamaica, the director of the writing center, and she was saying it's kind of like a contract where you're saying you guys sign off on this because it's giving you guys proof that I can do this research, that I deserve this money, that I deserve this time. So in that sense, it's kind of like a promise from the researcher to their committee that they have their plan in place, that they're going to be able to do it. And so for that reason, it's really important that your writing is clear and conveys how well you can do your research. So yeah, this is what some folks already put into the chat, but the easiest way to imagine a proposal for people who don't know what's in a thesis or dissertation proposal is generally just a thesis or dissertation without the results, discussion, and conclusion. It's gonna be some variation on an introduction that states your question and its stakes. Sometimes the question is like highlighted earlier or more highlighted than it will be in the final document. Other times it's like people just use basically the same thing. A literature review and a description of your proposed methods. So of course, for people who've already done their thesis or dissertation and are thinking more about grant and fellowship applications, those formats are much more variable, but the purpose, they're making the same argument. So generally they contain the same elements, just in a different order sometimes. And these are just a few basics. So like I said before, trying to get as much information as possible about the length and formatting requirements for your proposal ahead of time is helpful for those of you who are like, I tried and there's nothing, I'm sorry. Definitely for grant applications, there tends to be really specific guidelines, including like font, formatting, all that stuff. So you really want to try to get that. For the majority of departments here, the proposals are ranging between 3,000 and 5,000 words, or about 10 and 20 pages. Definitely the 5,000 word ones are more common for the dissertation proposals, and thesis proposals are often shorter, but some departments, I think history also, the thesis proposals can be that long. Some are shorter. I know biology and all of its associated departments are like 6 pages for master's and 8 pages for PhD proposals. And then some have no maximum page limit. And I know that people have come in and said, I was given 3 examples and one was 60 pages long and one was 20 pages long. How do I know which one to do? How do I know how long mine should be?
That's relatable. My advisor sent me dissertation proposals and that exact thing happened.
Really?
I was like, wow, that one's 3 times longer.
Yeah.
And they're both acceptable. That's confusing.
Yeah, I think the best I can like sort of figure is that, again, it just has to show that you can do what you're planning to do. I know some people for their dissertations are doing like 3 separate experiments. Often that's why they're longer.
Yeah.
Or their experiment has 3 parts, something like that, like genotypic, phenotypic, and another kind of field experiment, something like that. Usually that's the case with the longer ones. Other times, someone just has something that needs a super long literature review, or something like that. But I would say the 60-page ones are maybe more rare, but they definitely exist. So yeah, for those asking about length and formatting, I will say in terms of literal formatting, a lot of people just use the COGS formatting for their final thesis or dissertation proposal. So if you just go on the COGS page and go to thesis and dissertation resources and download that Word document that has all of the formatting for COGS and just plug your proposal into that, that is something that a lot of people do. And then again, it saves you a step because you don't have to change anything. Yeah, I'll say that, I can say the research, do you want to pop that in the chat too?
Right.
Amanda's gonna put the link in the chat. So it's basically just a Word document, yeah, that has the formatting for final theses and dissertations. And a lot of people, yeah, they just put their proposal right in there. And then like, okay, it's 20 pages in this format. I know how long it is, know how long it's gonna be. And then you do not have to change it very much at all before you do your final submission. So one of the main technical differences between a proposal and a thesis or dissertation is that the method section is in the future tense. A lot of times people come in and they're like, the only thing my advisor told me was that the method section is in the future tense. And I don't know what they mean, which basically just means people usually figure it out, but it just means that typically a method section is written in the past tense. You say, we performed this experiment and then we planted these seedlings and then we did this, and it's all in the past tense. And for the dissertation, it will be, we will do this, or for the proposal, it'll be, we will do this, we will do that. It's all going to be in the future tense. There's a funny thing that happens, which is that some people have done preliminary experiments or have preliminary data, and they're like, what tense do I write in then? Because I've already done it, but it's technically a proposal, so I'm supposed to act like I haven't. That is always just confusing, and you should generally try to ask your advisor, but generally we end up doing it in the future tense if some of the experiments haven't been done yet, and just sort of act like you haven't done it for the sake of the cohesiveness of the writing. Other times I think it's maybe not so big of a deal, but that question does come up surprisingly often. Yeah, so like we said, simple jargon-free language that's accessible to someone not in your immediate field. So that's maybe more true with grant and fellowship applications, although again, sometimes you're applying to a really specific technical grant agency that only gives really, money to people in your exact discipline, and they want to know that you're doing really rigorous science. And so then you'd probably think about your audience and use more technical language than you might for a agency that gives to a much broader range of researchers and might not know about your exact field. But for your dissertation or thesis proposal, a lot of people have committee members that aren't in their department. Like people in education will have a statistician on their committee, and so they need to write about the education stuff in an accessible way for that person. So thinking about that. And again, that can also be a good way to clarify your thoughts, because maybe it's the first time you're writing to someone not in your immediate field. And yeah, a lot of people break their sections up into subsections, and we'll talk a little more about that as we go along, but it can just be a helpful way, whether it's breaking your introduction up into research questions, purpose of study, significance of study, or whether it's breaking your literature review up into different sections that discuss the different aspects of the background for your study. Thinking about the narrative of your research and making yourself an outline where you think about, okay, these are the different subsections I'm going to want in here, can be really helpful. So then just thinking kind of briefly about what's literally going to be in there and what kind of almost always has to be in there. Of course, the clear articulation of your research questions / hypotheses, and a clear articulation of the significance of the questions / hypotheses are kind of the first things that people want to see towards the top of a proposal in general. You should be easily able to answer that question, why should I care about your research? And so again, for people not in your immediate field on your committee, you're going to have to talk about that a lot if you have a proposal defense. And so you want to be really comfortable with answering that question, and writing it down in the form of your proposal can be a good way to get really comfortable with it. Subheadings that, you know, you can see to frame that. And this is one of the most confusing things about proposals, is how people use different subheadings or frame their questions in different ways. And I think a lot of people, they'll be given different examples with different ones, and they're like, why doesn't my department just have a template that I fill out and have them all look just the same? And the answer, I guess, is that your committee wants you to really think through. I mean, and I'm speaking, I don't know that this is always true, but just in general, the impression I get working with writers, hearing what the feedback they get, is that they really want you to think through, like, what's the most logical way to present my question, my research. Other departments may have specific templates or formats you have to fill out, so ask them. I'm by no means saying that none of them do. I think the biological sciences do have a pretty strict guideline, and I don't see many students from those departments because I think a lot of them know what they're doing. And then others have are very inconsistent. And in terms of some of them, it does depend on your research methodology, and hypotheses you see a lot less, and you don't really see in qualitative studies as much, because often they're in the context of your statistical and presenting your statistical analysis. It's that's where you would state those. So it does depend on the nature of your research. And then in terms of the literature review and thinking about what needs to be in the literature review, it should, again, it'll usually be very similar to what's in your final thesis or dissertation. So thinking about what does my audience need to know in order to understand the narrative of my research? What's the background or the scholarly landscape that surrounds my research? And what will help make that point that my research is kind of making an essential contribution to my field. And also show a lot of times the literature review contains quite a bit that justifies the reasoning methods or questions that you're going to be pursuing in your research. So sometimes you have to show why other methods for doing what you're doing have failed, or other questions that are arguments that are similar to yours have kind of created the opening for your research. And then I have noticed that sometimes when people bring in a proposal and they're like, okay, I'm ready to revise this for my final, dissertation or thesis defense, we actually end up deciding that they can cut some stuff from their literature review because they thought they were going to do another experiment that they didn't end up doing. And so now it's too long. Other times they found something new in the course of their research and realized they need to add a bunch in. But in other words, again, it's still really helpful for your final defense because you've got a lot of that already written. Yeah, in grant proposals, literature reviews are generally woven into the other sections most often. So you will, when you're describing your methods, justify them with past research, but not have a whole section about it. But yeah, in the thesis or dissertation proposal, it's usually its own section or chapter, depending on how they tell you to do it. And then other sort of purposes of the proposal, and again, this is gonna be more or less relevant to certain disciplines than others, which is why if this isn't helpful to you in your discipline, I'm so sorry. Come to the Writing Center and we can talk about your specific piece. But just sort of as a general thing, one of the reasons for the proposal is to prove an understanding, but also defend your methodology, defend any theoretical frameworks you plan to use, and the plan for your research methods. So sometimes I know that people maybe you have a committee member who really likes a different theoretical framework and is going to push for, ask you, why didn't you choose this one? Why the one you chose has limitations? Why didn't you consider this other one? So part of what you're doing when you're writing this and is writing out for yourself why you chose the one you chose and defending your choice of the one you chose with evidence for why it is applicable to your research. And the same goes for methods, although most often people are like, yeah, there's this other one that's way better, but I chose this one because it's cheaper and I wasn't allowed to do the other. But so finding some like, you know, finding a way to say that that's not quite that. But again, ways to like articulate and justify why your plan is, why your plan makes sense and it's workable. And I have noticed sometimes that when people write out their methods for their proposal, again, sometimes they're actually longer than they end up being for the final thesis or dissertation because they included levels of detail that aren't actually needed for like the more broadly outward facing document, but that were needed to defend their whole plan. It's not always the case, but and then yeah, if you're doing data analysis, you need to have a plan for that and a plan for reporting data. In a humanities thesis, and this is totally different, and you have an outline of the planned chapters a lot of times. So in a history thesis or dissertation, you would have the title and an outline for the chapters you're planning to include, and then a bibliography. And again, back to that question of justifying, sometimes people are asked to include acknowledgements of the limitations of some theory, method, tool, sample population, whatever it is. If there's like an obvious hole in their plan, then it's like good to write about that and acknowledge it. And often people's advisors will tell them that and have sort of give them a hint about how they might incorporate that. And then, yeah, sometimes people include something about anticipated or preliminary results. And yeah, sometimes people talk about ethical issues or plans for IRB approval that they're going to ask for. And sometimes, and your department, I think, should be clear if they want this, if they want a schedule or a timeline. I think a lot of grant and fellowship proposals want a schedule or a timeline. And some of the departments here very clearly state that they want it, and others, I think, are more vague about it. So trying to figure out if that's wanted is another thing that you could do.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, for sure.
So in that first bullet point, you mentioned like acknowledging limitations. Would that be like of particular things in the literature? I mean, you also talk about methods and tools, but would that be, could it be limitations of like what you may find? Or like how far do you go with limitations?
Yeah.
Because like when a study's complete, you often talk about limitations.
Yeah.
How is it different? Like,
yeah, that's a good question. And again, I think that it's one of those things that is really on a case-by-case basis, because sometimes I think that people have proposals that don't go there at all because their plan just seems really solid and no one would look at it and be like, what about this thing? But I think that obviously acknowledging the limitations is something you do in that discussion section of your final work, right? Mm-hmm. So that's typically at the end. And so I think that sometimes someone will come in, and I mostly put this in because sometimes people come into the writing center and their advisor has told them like, you're going to want to talk a bit about maybe like why we chose this specific tool. So some people do have like, and because someone's going to ask you why we didn't use this other one or something like that.
right.
And so sometimes I do think that people have a sort of like section after their methods that's not exactly a discussion, but like that kind of thing. Other times for their when people talk about their theoretical framework in their method section. I've seen people include a little bit about another theoretical framework or the benefit of this one over the other. But I think those sections are, that's why I put them in here, and the like I don't know. That's definitely less common, and something I more specifically see when someone has like something obvious that people are going to ask them about or something and have been told to talk about that, if that makes sense. I have also seen some grant proposals though specifically ask you to acknowledge the obvious limitations of some method or something that you're using, if there are any. So it is one of those things that just every once in a while comes up.
And that makes sense if like the idea of a dissertation or a thesis is to like add to the body of literature, you may be trying something that others didn't try because of A, B, and C,
Right.
and you're like, I'm gonna try it in spite of A, B, and C because I think blah, blah, blah. Like,
Totally, yeah.
okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. And again, I wouldn't like worry about this in general as like a major thing that you need to include in every proposal.
Sure.
But I think that sometimes people talk about like as like a study population. Like sometimes your literature review will talk a lot about how, like, let's say it's for education or something, a lot about how the results from a certain study from, you know, about a certain thing have all been have shown that there's like going to be demographic differences in this or something. And you've chosen a study population that doesn't reflect those demographic differences. And so all the previous research is obviously calling for something slightly different, but you want to justify why you chose yours, which is usually that it was more practical, but that you still think your research could be valuable because it like will also set you up for future study, set people up for future work that's going to be. So like when you write about how you chose your study population, you might just include a teensy bit about that or something like that, or acknowledge that. If your literature review all is going to like be begging your committee to ask, well, why didn't you do this, if that makes sense? Because sometimes people do end up in those kinds of situations. But yeah, sorry if that was confusing and
no, it's fascinating. I just hadn't really considered it as something to put in there, and it seems really important. Like if you're gonna have to defend it, like it'd be good to know what you might need to defend and perhaps include it if that's appropriate.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think it's helpful. Like I know departments have that as part of their prelim process, kind of, where you're thinking about competing theories or competing methods for something, and like then justifying your choice of the one you chose. So it definitely is kind of like, again, maybe feeling out from your advisor whether it feels like that's going to be something you're going to want to think about or not. So then just thinking about, someone is asking, share more about free manuscript dissertations.
It's a little bit off topic for this presentation.
Yeah, we can go back. But this is just talking about, so yeah, the next stage here, I would really love to get more questions. Basically, what I have at this point are just a few writing strategies for that are kind of like broadly applicable to all kinds of scholarly writing, but also that I found to be really useful when working with people who are doing research proposals. And some of them I talked about a bit last fall, so I'm sorry if some of these are repetitive for those of you who were here last fall. For those of you who are new, hopefully they can also be helpful. But one of the things I do a lot with people who are doing proposals are reverse outlines, because sometimes people got started, they wrote a draft, and then they are like, oh, I feel like this draft is meandering and I'm missing information that should be in here, and I've included information that's redundant. So this is like a really simple writing strategy, but it's something that I feel like a lot of proposal writers have found quite helpful, is to look at their proposal. And once you have that draft, take a new piece of paper and then just summarize the topic summarize the topic of each existing paragraph in like a sentence, and then read those out and think about whether it seems like a logical narrative. Is it telling a clear story of your proposed research? Is everything coming in the correct order? Has anything important been left out? Because sometimes once you do that, it'll be really obvious that you just should put your literature review in a different order, that the narrative isn't streaming logically, or that you have 4 paragraphs on a topic that's sort of to the side of your main topic and not enough paragraphs on your main question and it states. So again, just a writing strategy that can be really helpful for structuring proposals.
I don't know.
Happened.
Jumped out of there for some reason.
Strange. Let's see if we can get it back. Okay,
If
well,
you can't get the slideshow to go, maybe you could just put that little arrow that shows the little slide previews, and then we can just look at it this way. If the slideshow's
yeah,
gonna be
it's
stubborn.
showing for the, oh yeah, it is. Shoot, sorry guys.
It's okay.
Not sure why this happened.
But even if it's just like that, it's just fine.
Okay, okay.
It's not a
Let
problem.
me stop it then for the Zoom people. Oh, shoot. Because they're gonna be confused.
While you're getting that set up, I can read in the chat, just while you're getting back on there. We had a little tangent a little bit that there's in the chat, there's different ways of formatting a dissertation that I didn't know about when I was starting this process, and people were asking about it. Where sometimes your dissertation is going to look a lot like this proposal with your intro, lit review, and methods, and then results and discussion. And then sometimes the main body of your dissertation is going to have 3 published articles. So it's really, I just said in the chat, it's really important to talk with your advisor about the different options, if both of those are an option for you, or if just one, that kind of thing. So
there is a general template for the dissertation.
yes, there is a template that is really helpful that's been
and I think it's applicable for all departments. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, it does need to be used for every department. Some use LaTeX, which is a little trickier. If your department uses that, ask your department for a template for that, because they don't, COGS doesn't have one, but yeah. All right, did I stall enough?
Oh yeah, well, we'll just look at it at this size.
Yeah,
Hopefully
that
that's
works.
okay.
Yeah.
I think the Zoom people can see it.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, so reverse outlines. And then we'll just talk a little bit. We're running low on time. Also, if anyone has, I would say if people have more questions that you want to go ahead and put in the chat, feel free to do that as well. And if people in the room have more questions, start getting ready, because we're gonna run out of time like we did with questions last time. So yeah, I think also just again, because a lot of people are writing this proposal when they haven't been doing a ton of writing for a little bit, going to the basics and structuring your paragraphs. Again, even more so than with other kinds of academic writing, it's really important that your proposal is really clear and legible to people maybe outside your immediate field. So keeping your language simple, but also keeping your paragraphs simple and well structured. Again, some of these writing strategies sound basic, but it can be so helpful to remind yourself. Having a topic sentence that features at least one of the paragraphs, main characters, the proposal's main characters, the things that we're going to be tracking throughout that we want to make sure we understand. And that gives us context for what that paragraph is going to be discussing and provides a thorough introduction to the paragraph's main topic. In most cases, each paragraph should have only one main topic, and all of the remaining sentences should elaborate on that topic in some way. And as a rule, academic paragraphs should be 3 to 6 sentences long. So sometimes people get into describing their work and just lose track of the fact that they've started to write really long paragraphs. So this is another thing we commonly work on when we're revising proposals. And then using parallel sentence structure for paragraphs with related information. This is especially true in method sections, and it's also true in results sections, which are not going to be in your proposal. But if you're writing about some kind of like technical process that you're going to be going through, and you're going to be doing a multi-step process or the same thing at multiple sites or something like that, making sure that there's a parallel sentence and paragraph structure that you use to describe those things that look the same can really just clarify and make the reading experience much easier for someone. There we go, sorry. The other thing that we discussed last fall, and this is just a general writing strategy that I was going to finish off with, not exclusive to proposals by any means. So if anyone does have a question that they want to jump in with, feel free to do that. And otherwise I'm going to spend the last few minutes just talking about this general writing strategy. And if you have more specific proposal questions, definitely come into the writing center. But if you do have another question, feel free to throw it in the chat. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept of the topic and the stress position, because this I think people often find really helpful, and we talk about it a lot with all kinds of academic writing, but again, with something that's supposed to be really clear and reach an audience, it can be really helpful. Okay, more information. And again, we did look at this last fall, so sorry if it's repetitive to you, but when you're kind of reading and interpreting any text, we rely on a mixture of the context the writer has given us and our expectations based on our past experiences with similar texts. So for that reason, we have certain ways that if information is laid out in certain ways, it's a lot easier for us to access than if it's laid out in other ways, right? So a good example is these numbers. So these are 3 different ways to lay out these numbers, which are temperatures taken at different time intervals. So the first way is in this straight line where they've written the temperature and the time one after the other, basically in the form of a sentence. That's incredibly confusing and hard to interpret.
Could you enlarge the
that unfortunately
from here? Yeah.
It's a little hard. I guess we can enlarge it. It's gonna disappear soon. You can definitely come sit closer. Sorry, it's so small. But if you look at this one, you have this one here on the right side of the screen is still a little bit confusing because temperature is the unpredictable factor. Time is the predictable factor that we can understand, and temperature is the unpredictable factor that we can't understand. So if the context comes first before something that we understand and can predict comes first before something new and unfamiliar, that makes the thing a lot easier for us to decipher. So basically the easiest form for this information to come in this example is this example here on the lower left side of the screen, where the predictable thing, the time intervals that we can totally understand, are on the left, and they're providing context for the temperature intervals, the unpredictable, new, important information. So that's kind of like a visual way to conceptualize this idea of the topic and the stress position, which you can use in sentences and paragraphs. So we'll go into a bit more about that. So in sentences and in paragraphs and in something like a proposal where you're writing about a topic that some of your audience is going to be unfamiliar with, you're going to, again, look to that first position, things things right at the beginning of a sentence or right at the beginning of a paragraph to provide context to interpret what you're going to be reading about next. So as they're saying in this paper, The Science of Scientific Writing, readers expect a unit of discourse to be a story about whoever shows up first. So their example here is that bees disperse pollen and pollen is dispersed by bees are two different but equally respectable sentences about the same facts. The first tells us something about bees, the second tells us something about pollen. So they're arguing that if you're proposing to work on research that's about the topic of pollen, then pollen is dispersed by bees is a better sentence to start off with than bees are dispersed by, or bees disperse pollen. Because it's gonna, your readers are gonna know right away, this is what this is gonna be about. This is gonna be the main character in this story. So when you're writing a research proposal, the main characters in your proposal, you're gonna wanna put those in the topic position of your paragraphs, of your sentences, so that it really feels like we're getting a story that's about that. So they're going to look for that familiar information there, for the context there. And when on the flip side, when old information does not appear at all in a sentence, whether in the topic position or elsewhere, then readers often construct those logical linkages by themselves. And this is what gets back to what people often tell me when they come in with their proposals is this often happens when the connections are so clear in the writer's mind that they seem unnecessary to state. Those moments writers underestimate the difficulties and ambiguities inherent in the reading process. So again, this is why it's a good thing to think about in this proposal. When you're writing these proposals, you're taking your work for the first time out of your own mind and into the world. And so, yeah, if you just sort of follow these, we'll give you these slides. This video will be available so you can return to them. But basically, having those, I'm sorry, I'm getting rushed because I realize we're about to run out of time. But on the flip side of the topic position, having those words those keywords that link together the main narrative, people look to the beginnings for context and to the endings for new and important information. So if you're reading bees carry pollen, many people would guess that bees are the subject of the narrative, but pollen is going to catch your attention. So we feel that it must have been introduced for a reason, and you're going to expect that the paragraph will then tell you more about pollen. So basically, again, readers also tend to have that innate expectation that the most interesting information should come at the end. So if we have enough context that we don't feel lost, we like when readers save the best for last, because that builds the momentum and the flow of the narrative. So just thinking about these topic and stress positions as you revise a proposal, as you go through, these are some of the things that we often do when writers come in with proposals to discuss them with me in the Writing Center. We look at the overall structure by making one of those reverse outlines, and then we start looking at the structure of each paragraph. We don't always do this because sometimes people already know how to do it, but start looking at the structure of each paragraph, and then if we still want to make it clearer and stronger, we start looking at the structure of the sentences and thinking about whether they're sort of making use of these concepts of the topic and the stress position. If new and important information is coming at the end so that the narrative is building and that familiar contextual information, those main characters of your research are coming at the beginning to give your readers sort of a clear, familiar experience. Okay, now I know that we are out of time and there's some folks waiting outside to use the room, but we'll give you these slides. I know we got a little rushed at the end. And again, please come into the Writing Center if you want to discuss your specific proposal question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Will these slides be made available?
Yes, so they'll be in the Canvas course, as long as Isabel sends them, I'll put them in there.
Yeah, I'll send you, and I didn't send the abstract ones yet. I'll send those too.
Perfect. We'll put them
I wasn't sure if you needed them in